This video is all about things you can do with switches and dynamic signal routing in a modular synth. And to explore these concepts, I'll be using this, a patching matrix called Exchange from the Bristol-based Eurorack brand Archaea, who are kindly sponsoring this video. Whether it's routing sequences to different voices on the fly, or instantly changing where modulation is being sent, manipulating your signal paths can add a whole new dimension to your patching. Here's a quick taste of what's coming up. Exchange is a patching matrix with 8 inputs that can each be routed to one or more of the 8 outputs. It's not a mixer, so each output can only receive a signal from one input at a time, but an input can be multed to more than one output. You can save sets of routings as presets, which you can then change using triggers, CV, or MIDI. This lets you instantly switch up the routing of an entire patch, whether that's trigger patterns going to different drum voices, or melodic sequences and CV sources going to different destinations. By setting up an appropriate series of presets, you can use Exchange as a classic sequential switch, where a number of inputs can be routed in turn to a single output, or a single input can be routed in turn to a number of outputs. You can use triggers to step through the routings in order or randomly. You can also emulate modules like the ADAC 214 VC rotator or the noise engineering vice versa by setting up Exchange as a rotating switch where a series of inputs are routed in turn or randomly to a series of outputs. And Archaea also makes special adapters for the rear panel that let you interface directly with the expander ports on the Music Thing modular Turing Machine and the Leibniz binary subsystem modules from Chaos Devices. Some of the patches in this video will be things you can try with other sequential or voltage controlled switches, while some will be unique to Exchange. Either way, you'll hopefully get a bit of patching inspiration. Here we go. Okay, let's get started by using Exchange to route some trigger sequences to some drum sounds, and we can explore some of the basic concepts as we go along. In the case here, I've got LX Euclid from A to V Project and Zularic Repetitor from Noise Engineering. They're both being clocked by PAMs and they each have 4 trigger outputs. I've patched all of these trigger outputs into the 8 inputs on the left side of Exchange, and I've patched the 8 outputs on the right side of Exchange to the trigger inputs on Squid Sample, which has a drum kit loaded. If I get the sequences going, we won't hear anything yet because I haven't actually made any connections from the left side to the right side. The basic idea is you select an input by pressing the corresponding button on the left column, and then you select an output on the right to route that input to. So if I route input 1 to output 1, this is a 4/4 kind of kick pattern coming out of LX Euclid going to a kick drum sample. And I could route that same rhythm to the other drum sounds in turn. So I've got snare, closed hat, open hat, clap, some other percussion. You might notice when I'm overlapping these, we can actually patch to all 8 if we want it, or mult that input to the 8 outputs. However, you can't mix inputs, so any output can only have one input connected to it at any one time, if that makes sense. Let's just patch each input to its corresponding output. And this is our kind of full 8-part pattern. And in this mode we can sort of play with muting parts one by one. We could also play with, for example, swapping the routing of a couple of parts. Sort of change the rhythms up a bit. So you can easily kind of start mixing and matching to kind of change patterns up. With this parts 1 to 4 routed, let's save that as a preset. So if I just hit preset, we select a bank on the left and then a preset number on the right, and you just press and hold the button on the right to save it. So let's save this to bank 5 preset 1. And then let's bring in all 8 parts and save that as preset 2. So just press and hold button 2. And now we can toggle between them by pressing preset, and then that's preset 1. So you can see with the same kind of set of trigger sequences coming in, we could save a bunch of different presets with different mappings, different mute states if you like, more or less complex patterns, which is quite handy. Now, where things get a bit more interesting is the fact that you can change these presets via CV or triggers or even MIDI. There's a USB MIDI input at the top of Exchange. I should say I'm not going to explore the MIDI applications in this video, so I don't really have a MIDI-based setup here, but you can connect this to a MIDI host and then it will accept MIDI CCs to change presets, which is pretty straightforward. The basic idea with preset addressing or preset switching is that you define a start and an end preset from the ones that you've got saved on Exchange. And that defines the number of presets that it's going to kind of skip between. And then there are various modes to change through them. You can either skip through them in order every time it gets a trigger or advance to the next one. You can skip through them randomly with a couple of different random modes, or you can use CV to select which preset is active. And the way that works is it divides a 0 to 5 volt incoming CV by however many presets are in your range that you want to switch between. So for example, if you've just got 2 presets, then 0 to 2.5 volts will select the first one, and 2.5 to 5 will select the second one. As you add more presets to your group, those voltage ranges get smaller and smaller accordingly. You might have noticed I've got all 8 inputs patched here, and that doesn't leave any other inputs on the front of Exchange for this CV or trigger signal that we want to use. That's where the expander comes in. You can connect an expander to the inputs and the outputs via the chain connector on the back, and you can use either the inputs on the expander or the inputs on the front panel to be your signal inputs. You can kind of switch between them by pressing the input button until it switches from green to red, the LEDs. Inputs 7 and 8 are basically the ones that are reserved for sequential skipping through the presets or CV addressing the presets, and also resetting. If you're using it sequentially, then input 7 is a reset back to the first starting preset that you've defined. So if you're using all 8 inputs on the front panel, you can use inputs 7 and 8 on the expander to do the preset switching, or vice versa. You could connect your signal sources to the 8 inputs on the expander. And you can also, because these are connected via ribbon cables on the back, you could locate these a bit further away from the main Exchange unit. In a bigger case, this is really handy. You could maybe put an expander next to your trigger sequences and have Exchange a bit further away, and you can likewise have an expander on the outputs which are a bit closer to your drum modules, and then you can spread things out in the case a bit. Let's have a look at addressing via trigger, and I'm just going to define the 2 patterns that the 2 presets that I just saved as our start and end. So we're just going to toggle between the 2 basically. So we'll just hit mode and hit start, and we'll define the start as bank 5 preset 1. Hit mode again to store that, and then we hit mode, select end, and we'll select bank 5 preset 2. Hit mode. Simple as that. So those are the 2 presets in the bank that we're going to toggle between. If we hit mode and select the CV/trig page, this is where we get the options for our preset control input. So These blue buttons on the right will select one of the modes. You need to refer to the manual for this. Basically, the top one is off, and the first one down is sequential triggering, trigger sequence, so they'll go through in order. Button 7 and 8 at the bottom determine whether it's the expander inputs that are used for this or the inputs on the module. With the blue lights unilluminated, it will be the ones on the expander. So let's come out of there and let's go into the input 8 on the expander. And if I get this going again, I'm hitting a trigger every 2 bars into here from PAMS, which is going to toggle between the two. So we're just alternating between the fuller version of the sequence and the sparser version with a few triggers muted. If you want to use Exchange as a conventional sequential switch, then it's really easy to do. In fact, there are a few banks of factory presets in Exchange when you first power it up, which are already configured to let you use it as a rotating switch, a many-to-one sequential switch, and a one-to-many sequential switch. The presets in Bank 2, for example, as you step through them, they will map the inputs in turn to a single output, like a conventional sequential switch does. So to demo this, I've got a classic sequential switch patch where we've got 4 outputs from an oscillator that's just off screen going into the first 4 inputs here on Exchange. And as I step through the presets in Bank 2, it will map them one at a time to this single output. The output's going to go through a filter and a VCA, and the oscillator is going to be driven by a sequence from the octone here. So if I get that going, we're going to listen first of all to the triangle wave that's coming in on input 1 being routed through. And if I switch presets to Bank 2 preset 2, we're now mapping input 2, which is a saw wave with a bit of modulation happening. If I then map preset 3, that's the square wave coming on input 3 being routed through, and preset 4 is a pulse wave with a bit of PWM happening as well. And if we want to step through these with an external clock signal, it's just a case of hitting mode, hitting start, and selecting Bank 2 preset 1 to be the start point, hit mode again, then define the end point as being Bank 2 preset 4, hit mode again, and now when I fire a slow clock into input 8 down here, it's going to step through these, so I'll get a couple of repetitions of each one in turn. I'm in the kind of sequence trigger mode, so it's just going to go through them in the order. We could take one of the steps out of the sequencer to cause the triggering, which will make it go a bit faster. Basically every loop through now, it will change. And we could change the trigger mode to random, so let's go to the CV trig, next one down. This means every time it loops through the sequence, it's going to pick a new waveform to send through. So we've got classic sequential switching and kind of random sequencing as well. And we can also do it the other way around, where we feed one input to different outputs in turn. The Bank 3 presets are set up to do that. What I've got here is the same sequence we just heard, but rather than switching between different oscillator outputs in turn, we're going to feed the gates from the sequencer to 3 different voices in turn. So I'm going to have the gates from the sequencer coming in on input 1, and the 3 outputs are sent to the envelopes or LPGs for 3 different voices. So if we just get the sequence going again, these gates are being fed through to trigger the envelope on the first voice. If we switch to preset 2 in Bank 3, we're now routing those gates to my second voice, and preset 3 to the third voice. So these voices are all off screen. And as before, we can set the start and end points to be presets 1 to 3, and then we can start feeding a clock in to skip through them sequentially. So yeah, it's really easy to do both types of sequential switch. We can either have up to 8 inputs routed to 1 output, or 1 input routed to up to 8 outputs. So next I want to try a slightly more complex patch where I've set up Exchange as a rotating switch, which is going to feed 4 different trigger patterns in turn to 4 different voices, and they're going to take it in turns. Each voice will basically take it in turns to receive each trigger pattern, and they'll all be getting them at the same time. The patch is basically a 4-chord sequence which is being generated by Harmonic. I've got a sequence from the Turbinski sequencer, which is just off screen here, going into the Harmonic, and then the 4 voices out of there are going to 4 oscillators in the rack that's just off screen. I'm going to let you hear them one at a time. The trigger patterns are going to come from Zularic Repetitor. If I just listen to the root voice first of all. So this is a saw wave from the EN129. And it's just kind of going up the root note of this chord pattern. The next voice is the Kaliosk from Turbinski, which is getting the part a third up. And that's getting a different rhythm from Zularic Repetitor. At the moment we're just going straight through third voice. This is a Chemy's Castle from ALM, sort of FM tone, just playing the 5th. And the 4th voice. This is the Hieroglyphic Plume, which is another digital voice. So this pattern from Zularic is creating this nice kind of interlocking feel. But I can skip through the 4 presets I've set up. And then these trigger patterns are going to be routed to the next voice in turn. Which just gives a slightly different flavour each time. So again, I've got a very slow clock from PAMS, which I can go into the trigger input here. So we'll get every new loop of the 4-chord sequence, we're going to change the preset. So although the actual rhythmic elements are the same, different voices are playing them each time, which adds even more interest to this fairly simple chord sequence. And if we turn up the reverb and delay a bit and start playing with the voicing on Harmonic, So here's another rotating switch patch where I'm using all 8 ins and all 8 outs. And it's just a Chemy's Castle droning. And I've got loads of different modulation sources patched into Exchange. I've got a couple of sequences of different lengths, just CV sequences. I've got 4 different LFOs from Oct, right at the top left of the case. And I've got a couple of envelopes being triggered by the end of those sequences. And they're at the moment just going into various levels, multipliers, wave shapes, feedback amounts on a Chemy's and producing this really rich, complicated FM drone sound. And if I rotate through the presets in bank 1, this will change which modulation source is mapped to which parameter, and it gives us a totally different texture. This is the real beauty of Exchange, I think, is being able to completely repatch something like this with a button push rather than reconnecting 16 patch cables. And I've got a clock divider set up with one of these sequence end of triggers to give me a sort of occasional clock, and I'm going to use that to skip through these presets. I've got it on the random mode, so whenever this clock fires, it'll pick a new one. So every time Exchange changes, we get this new mapping of the modulation. So this is just a single voice with a load of modulation chucked at it. Admittedly, a pretty complicated voice, but it's a really powerful way of addressing your modulation. So it's even possible to patch Exchange as a kind of crude sequencer, and there's a couple of different approaches to this. One would be to use the previous sequential switch patch I kind of demonstrated and feed a number of different offset voltages into the inputs and then step through them in turn at one output. I'm going to try a slightly different approach where I'm going to feed in a continuous 5-volt signal to the input, just generating that with an offset from Quadrat. And then I'm going to patch the first 6 outputs to this DAC module from Beers. What this does, whenever it gets a high gate at any of these inputs, it adds the corresponding number of semitones worth of voltage to the output. So basically by turning on different configurations of these 1, 2, 4, 5, 7 and 12 semitones, you can create any musical interval you like, and effectively you can then create a pitch sequence at the output by turning them on and off. So by routing that 5 volts using these buttons to these 6 inputs of the DAC, I can create different notes. Let me show you what I mean. If I get the oscillator droning, it's just a wavetable oscillator with a little bit of LFO movement in the MCO. And if I start turning on some of these buttons to route this 5 volt to the DAC, you see I can create different notes by combining these different offsets which are added effectively to this output here. So I've made a bank of presets which I can just skip through with different notes. And of course we can now clock through those presets using a clock from PAMS. And we'll take that same clock to trigger the internal envelope on the MCO. And we've got a little sequence. We can also randomize that order. At the moment it's just playing them in order, but we can go to the CV trig mode. Up the rhythm a little bit. And of course, if you don't have a DAC module, you can actually do something similar just with a mixer. Just weight the amounts of these 5 volts that are coming in and then run it through a quantizer. The advantage of this DAC is it doesn't need to be quantized because these are kind of precision intervals. But yeah, probably not your first port of call for a sequencer, but it might inspire a few things you can do with Exchange in this kind of vein. Now, Archaea also make an adapter for the chain connections on the back of Exchange, which is compatible with the Music Thing modular Turing Machine expanders. That means you can connect a Turing Machine's gates or pulses output directly to Exchange using a ribbon cable underneath, and then you'll have access to those gates or triggers to route elsewhere in your system using Exchange as normal, which is super handy. If you're not familiar with the Turing Machine, there's loads of other content out there about it already, so I'm not going to go into loads of detail. It's basically a shift register based CV sequencer or sequence pattern generator, which generates random patterns which you can then lock in and loop. It's really useful for sequencing melodies, and using these gates and trigger expanders, you can use it to program drum sounds as well. So what I've got set up in this patch is I've got the pulses output connected to the input of Exchange. That's going to give me trigger patterns basically which follow the changing bits in the shift register. I'm going to use the first 4 of these to route to drum sounds. I haven't got anything routed at the moment, but I'm going to sort of patch them up using Exchange in a minute. I've also got on inputs 5 and 6 on the front of Exchange, a kind of 4/4 kick and open hi-hat part coming straight from PAMS, just a straightforward kind of 4/4 rhythm, which I'm going to use to route to some other drum sounds just to kind of anchor the rhythms a bit. I'm going to take the CV output of the Turing Machine into the MCO for a kind of synth part, which I'll introduce in a minute. But let's just get things rolling. Nothing's patched yet. If I patch this first bit output from the Turing Machine, which is currently just in the 12 o'clock random position, you can see these bits are kind of changing randomly. Let's patch that to the snare on Squid Sample. And you'll see that this first bit, as that kind of activates and deactivates, it triggers the snare. The second bit, I'm going to route to a closed hi-hat. And the third to a clap. And the fourth to a tom. Now let's just lock in a pattern. And we can play with routing these differently. Let's actually take bit 8, say, to the tom. And bit 7 to the closed hat. And let's just bring in the kick drum, which is coming in on channel 5 on the front panel. That's going to the kick on Squid. And I've got an offbeat hi-hat, also from PAMS on channel 6, which I'm going to route to the open hi-hat. So we can play with muting and unmuting these parts and routing and rerouting them. Quite fun too. Let's just bring in the synth part as well and hear how that sounds. And if we randomise the pattern a bit by turning the knob back, the drum pattern's changed up, it's got a lot busier. Just routing that to the ride cymbal as well, the open hat. Play with this pattern, get it a bit sparser. So what's really nice about this is these drum patterns evolve in parallel with the melody because they're all driven by the same set of bits. The melody's being derived by converting those bits into a voltage as it rotates through, and the individual bits are triggering the drum sound. So we've got all this related patterns which we can just kind of mutate. We can play with the range for the melody as well. This is being quantized inside the MCO. So I'm not even using presets in this patch on Exchange, I'm just manually routing things. Great fun to jam with. So when Aaron at Archaea first told me about Exchange and the fact that it has 8 ins and 8 outs, one of the first things that sprang to mind for me was the Leibniz binary subsystem from Chaos Devices. This is something I've covered on the channel quite a lot previously, so I'm not going to go into loads of detail, but basically the Leibniz binary subsystem transmits 8-bit data using a special bus on the back in the form of 8 parallel bit streams, or streams of gates essentially. And what Aaron's done is made an adapter for Exchange that lets you connect one of these Leibniz bus connectors directly to the module, which means you then have access on the front panel to those individual 8 bits, or those 8-bit streams that make up that data. You can then mute them, reroute them, mult them, and otherwise interfere with them and create some interesting wave shaping effects with audio and CV and other kind of rhythmic stuff if you're routing gates around to different destinations. Opens up quite a lot of possibilities to play with. So I thought I'd start with Berlin, which is the fairly straightforward oscillator in the Leibniz binary subsystem. That, on its Leibniz output on the back, basically outputs data representing a perfect rising saw wave. and then that's going to go into Exchange, where I can then send those bits to the output, and they'll go back into Berlin and be converted to analog again, and we'll be able to hear the results. So at the moment, I haven't connected any inputs to any outputs, but if I start building them up, starting at the bottom, which is the most significant bit, you'll see this start to form that saw wave with increasing resolution as these higher bits get added until we get this perfect saw. But we can, of course, turn some of these off. We could swap the orientation to generate a new wave shape, or we could do some multing of signals of bits to create these kind of distorted, square, stepped kind of shapes. And I've made a bank of presets like this, starting from the saw, with different configurations of bit mappings, which is essentially a wavetable of sorts. So this is just processing the bits coming out of Berlin and rerouting them, so mapping bit 4 to 5 and things like that. Let's just turn this down. So if I get a sequence going, we can pick different waves, and we can also, let's try switching waves on every note. So if I take a copy of the trigger, now every time it's firing a new note, it's stepping through and picking a different wave from that wavetable. We can filter it a bit to take some of those kind of jagged edges off. Turn off the Leibniz bus to just get the pure saw. That's the kind of unmolested signal. And here's what Exchange is doing to it. It's also quite fun to CV address that bank of presets. So let's go to the CV trigger mode and pick the CV mode, and I've got to start with a fairly slow triangle wave here that's going to sweep through them. So there's no interpolation, there's no kind of crossfade in between them, they're going to be hard jumps. So I'm basically scanning up and down through the 8 wave shapes in the bank. I can speed up that. This is a triangle wave from PAMS, just off screen. Exchange can run it up to about 50 Hz in terms of switching. It doesn't get quite up into proper audio rates, but I've still got some quite interesting effects like this. Just having a bit of delay from Samarkanda as well. So to finish, I'm going to do another Leibniz-based patch, but this time I'm going to use 2 Exchange units, and they're going to be linked via the, they're sort of sharing data via the Eurorack power bus. There's actually some really powerful linking and chaining options with Exchange. You can link multiple units, you can connect the outputs directly to the inputs using the ribbon cable. There's the expander I've already mentioned, there's the adapters for Turing Machine and Leibniz stuff. In this patch, I'm not doing anything too complicated. All I'm doing is linking the two, as I say, via that data bus on the Eurorack power connection. And that means that when I skip through when I trigger to change a preset on one unit, it will change on the other one as well. You can configure them to save and load presets in unison as well. In this one, what I've got set up is the left-hand Exchange is connected via Leibniz underneath to Erfurt, which is basically acting as a trigger sequencer. I'm feeding in a clock and I'm setting a counting interval with Lipsk, and then the 8-bit outputs that come into Exchange are putting out these gate patterns, which you can see flickering on the LEDs there. I'm routing them, some of those outputs through Samara for attenuation, and some straight into Odessa, which you can just see in the very top left of the picture. If I bring this up, it's another kind of droning patch, but I'm firing these little gate patterns, which are basically little 5-volt gates. Odessa's just droning, and I'm just creating quite a complex, heavily modulated sound. I've got a kind of rotating switch configuration set up here, so these different bit patterns are going into these 6 outputs. I'm using one of the bit outputs to trigger a change, so it's going to cycle through in a rotating switch kind of style 4 different configurations of these bits being routed to different modulation sources, similar to the drone patch from earlier on, but this time with kind of gate patterns. And by attenuating them, we get this kind of rhythmic drone animation, which is constantly changing because we're flicking between different rhythm patterns. The second exchange is also set up like a sequential switch, so I've got 4 gate patterns coming in from LX Euclid off screen, so 4 Euclidean trigger patterns, and they're being routed in turn with the same switch trigger on the first unit is triggering changes here. And if I use these patterns to ping Lublin, so we now get a different set of rhythms which are not related to these rhythms, but all kind of clocked from the same clock, so everything's in time. This is kind of pinging Lublin, which is the VCA that's opening. And I really recommend listening to this on headphones or good speakers. Play with the tension as well on Odessa with this control, which gets into quite atonal territory, but sounds pretty interesting in small doses. Let's just bring in a kick drum to kind of anchor this. And a couple of other drums. So there's a lot more to explore with Exchange, but this video is already getting pretty long, so I'm going to wrap up here, I think. Hopefully you've got a taste of what's possible with Exchange and modular switches in general. If you've enjoyed the video, please like, comment and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks again to Archaea for sponsoring the video, thanks to you for watching, and I'll see you next time.